Well, hello there, everyone.
Oh,
Welcome to our panel on Keepsake and Connected Path games with me, Shing Yin Khor, and my collaborator, Jeeyon Shim. I
hello.
don't know which side of the screen
I have
you
no.
are appearing. Oh, there you go. Thank you for fixing that. Wait, no, there you go. We got it. All right. So why don't we start by introducing ourselves, and you go first.
Hey, hi. My name is Jeeyon Shim. I realized I only put my first name in the display name, and that's okay. I am a game designer. I think I've been working since 2017. In fact, my first ever game convention was a Big Bad Con. You might know me from the game I co-designed with Shing, Field Guide to Memory. I also have my name on a lot of independent projects and recently also published The Shape of Shadows and The Last Will and Testament of Gideon Blythe. And earlier this year, I won the Diana Jones Emerging Designer Award in its inaugural year. So if you have heard of me, it is possibly from those things. And
It's my turn. Hi, I'm Shing Yin Khor. I'm an experienced designer, a cartoonist, and illustrator, and I've recently added game designer to my resume. Field Guide to Memory with Jeeyon Shim is actually my first game, although I've been doing game-adjacent work that I now also call games, if that makes sense. I had the Gentle Oraclebird at Indiecade in 2019 and 2020. I have also recently fulfilled A Mending, which is my sewing and map marking keepsake game. Um, and I build, large scale installation art that are essentially big narrative stories that people experience in real life.
yeah, you're,
And I also make comics. I'm sort of all over the place.
I mean, over the fact that your comic, The Legend of Auntie Po, is up for a National Book Award. That's very cool.
Yes, my most recent graphic novel, The Legend of Auntie Po, is a National Book Award finalist.
Yeah.
The eighth graphic novel to ever be one.
Yeah, you're so smart to mention adjacent work. I forgot to say that I worked as an outdoor educator before game design, and that informs pretty much everything I do. Just a small detail that I left out.
Oh, yeah, exactly. We keep on, but actually, I feel like that's a really good segue, which is like, how have our kind of collective life experiences led us to kind of these ideas that we're exploring in Keepsake and Connected Path games? Like, how did you get here?
I mean, you and I have talked about this just
Oh, we
ambient,
talk about it all the time, which is why it's great to do it in public.
like compress it. I mean, they're born out of like a combination of very deliberate and conscious design choices, as well as like that like inchoate ineffable thing that just happens with creative work sometimes. And I can start with the stuff that I know I'm doing on purpose, which is
Yeah, like start with like, kind of the connection to the natural world, because that
yeah,
is such like a large recurring theme in your work, but also very clearly in your life.
yeah. So I used to work at an organization called Earth, which is it has multiple branches, mostly on the West Coast. And it's an outdoor education company, and it mostly works teaching kids. Before I got hired there, I'd never gone camping. I'd never slept outside, certainly. And it was a crash course in not just learning how to do those things for myself, but also learning them so I could teach. But then, um, not on purpose, it completely shifted my paradigm of core values. Like land stewardship was something I cared about before, but I didn't know how to care about it on purpose, and I didn't have the information to know how to do it well. So my job as a instructor and then eventually program designer and academic teacher there, it totally radically like shifted everything about how I think about the world. And one of the biggest things is that I strongly believe that the phrase the natural world is a divider. It is an unnecessary division between us and the material world around us, because one of the biggest mistakes that's been born out of like colonialism, settlerhood, is this idea that the material physical world, nature, is separate from people somehow. And the natural world is my living room. The natural world is downtown Oakland. The natural world is the park. The natural world is also, Mount Diablo, which is not that far away. It's the ocean, it's the lake nearby. And wanting to guide people into that understanding for themselves so that they can feel a closer connection and not feel alienated with what's happening around them in this time of like really deep, intense existential change around the natural world is something that, in as much as you can do with art, I really want to do. I want to do it because we did it with kids for a long time at my old job. And so the games I make are kind of just an extension out of that. And in order to connect to the material world around you, you have to understand yourself and you have to understand your place in the ecosystem of your community, not just with people, but the non-human community around you. And that is the touchstone of pretty much everything I write.
Yeah, I think it's really clear. I also think that it's a perfect segue into talking about. I'm sorry, I'm totally like moderating this for us because I'm like, look, we're gonna just because I know like when we're talking, we can ramble on for hours. And I'm gonna try and keep it a little more compact for an audience. I think that that is a perfect segue into when we're talking about connected path games, which is so much about connection to each other, especially. And I think it's important to note that we started collaborating during quarantine. Like
Yeah.
we've actually never met in person.
I
Um, we've talked for hours upon hours at this point. We've made games together. We slipped off a bit, but we used to like talk every week
Yeah.
for hours.
Life
Um, and we still haven't actually met. But I think that dynamic is also something that very much has affected our work, and specifically connected path games, and how we're so devoted into building these connections over time, over distances, and also like connecting strangers together in a very similar way.
Yeah. 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 One of the things that I co-designed a game called Wait for Me with a designer named Kevin Culp, who also is what he did Time Watch and Swords of the Serpentine, which are very like traditional tabletop games. And I'm like anything. I'm actually only now learning to like adapt Powered by the Apocalypse games and like try to shift my work into like a group tabletop experience. But I came about it from a completely different angle. But Wait for Me is the game I designed with him. And that was a really informative experience in game design, and specifically like showing me what I wanted to do with the community aspect of it. And I feel like Field Guide to Memory, like it all clicked into place. The connected path, the reason we coined that term alongside Keepsake games, which to be clear, I'm not saying that I am the progenitor of this kind of game at all, or Keepsake games. Like there are so many games that predate me and Shing, and we'll talk about that later. But with Field Guide to Memory, I really wanted. We were in quarantine. I had realized that like because of the way that I keep in touch with people, I was like doing okay, but most of my friends were really not doing okay.
Yeah.
And we wanted to connect people to each other, but not in a way that created friction, right? Like Zoom, tech stuff, scheduling. It's so hard to feel connected and also make it work. And so we created this game that's very like solitary in its creation process, but then the sharing, right?
Mm-hmm.
For show and tell, you can make something at home and then you bring it in without that part of like the opting in, if you want to, of sharing it with your friends and seeing how they respond to it. Like that's the complete experience. Yeah.
I think you were, I mean, I think you just explained this perfect Venn diagram of Keepsake and connected path games with like show and tell, right? And I'm going to add like where my background comes from, which led me to Keepsake and connected path games. Um, I'm a scenic designer in theater, and I've been building things really for, I would say, almost my entire life, but seriously and professionally since I was about 18. And and one of my passions is, I think, the more I build things, the more I realize that kind of my true life passion wasn't in like acquiring more and more skill, but in kind of in teaching and reassuring everyone that yes, everyone has the ability to craft, everyone has the ability to make something, and to kind of pursue their own creative paths and tell their own stories. And a large part of what I was doing I was already starting to do it with my experience design and installation design work because I'm getting old and I can no longer build like 3-story like buildings out in the desert because I can no longer lift a 4x8 sheet of plywood by myself. Um, so I was being drawn to creating smaller and smaller experiences. And as a result, actually more intimate ones, which resulted in the Gentle Oraclebird and A Mending, was something that came out of a desire to, at the beginning of the pandemic, to bring all of these immersive experiences into the home in a way that could be experienced solo. And it was actually like very complex. And I think it was actually in my collaboration with you that I realized how simple game design could. I don't mean to say that game design is simple. It is absolutely not. But there is a simplicity of the craft that very much mirrors the way I build collaborative work, which is that I outline the universe and I invite my crew members to come play in it. And that describes games. Like it absolutely describes like tabletop role-playing games. You create a universe and then people come and play in it. Um, and that's always been linked to making objects for me. So when we coined the term keepsake, it is obviously in the lineage of so many other games, but we hadn't coined the term when we started the Field Guide to Memory Kickstarter yet. We were calling it a solo journaling game that produced an artifact and had a live game component where
Yeah.
you shared things with other people.
So much
And we
work.
kept on running into this unwieldy vocabulary. So for our own purposes, we wanted something more concise. Um, and I think like, whenever we talk about like, we are not claiming we invented these games. It's like, no, we are not. But we really needed a much more concise vocabulary for ourselves.
I mean, for me especially, I definitely have a tendency toward the verbose because I talk the way that I think, and the way that I think is just like the very with my students, I called it ecosystem thinking. Like I have a really hard time thinking in a linear, like point to point way. And so because of that, without clear vocabulary in a concise terminology, my I can make individual ideas clear, but I can't give them the umbrella that they need for someone to kind of be curious and want to step inside and see what it's about. And God, I remember even arguing if we should call it a LARP at one point. And I feel like that was the point where it's like, we need something. And
Yeah, we need something better than the language that exists.
yeah, struck me is like, honestly, the process of being like, we should coin these terms. And then we spent some time thinking about it. And we, like from various points in our lives came up with those two terms. And it just felt like making an artist statement. And
Yeah.
really like led me to the observation of like, oh, like, our backgrounds are so varied, right? We're both eclectic.
Ooh.
Oh, is there a good question in the chat?
There is, but I actually realized when you said artist statement, please define a connected path game for me.
Oh yeah. So path game currently often features a game, but it doesn't have to, because the defining feature of a connected path game is that every player has their own solo experience. They are one player games, but there is always a shared component that goes on with the game. So whether it is an in-world Discord or a hashtag on Twitter, which is what I often use, there is a way for players to see what their co-players are doing. And so imagine you're walking down a trail in a forest and you know that there are other trails alongside you. You can't always see them, but there are points there where there are clearings and you can see other people traveling with you. You're going your own way, but you're going the same way as well. And so connected path games are games that are meant to help people forge connections, but on their own time and with their own internal journeys. And the reason I love them with keepsake games is then you have literally like a show and tell object.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of the object, I'm going to quickly define keepsake games in one sentence. Keepsake games are games that produce a central physical artifact as a part of the game design process, which means that games that simply have beautiful physical items are not um, are not inherently keepsake games, but games where the player creates a physical object
Yeah.
is centrally as part of the game's central design.
And it,
And there is actually this goes back to what you were saying when how the way you talk and the way you write has a lot of ideas. There's a great question in chat that says, what helps guide choosing what parts of a game experience to keep versus remove for the design process for both your games? Actually, I'm going to quickly talk about A Mending because that was a game that I removed a million things from. It was initially patterned more after immersive theater experiences. So there were all sorts of elements in it, like, playing it by candlelight, playing it with like a certain soundtrack and music. And the thing that really stumped me was how the user or how the player would experience the game, or how the player would be able to tell their own story through the game. And essentially what happened, it was just kind of like a sudden, wait, games has actually figured this out. I played a game of For the Queen with oh my gosh, I have forgotten who it's by. If someone would like, I'm
yeah,
sorry, say that.
Alex Roberts. She's a
Alex Roberts, thank you. Yes, she's great. And the game is fantastic. And I played a round of For the Queen with some friends, and I was just like, wait, this has been solved. It's a deck of cards. You can just use a deck of cards. And when we were creating all the prompts from Field Guide, that was like a very central part of my inspiration as well. So ultimately, all the cards in A Mending really feel to me like a mashup of Field Guide's prompt system as well as like the deck-based story building system. And that was what the rest of the game coalesced around. I basically just threw out everything that didn't fit. So that's how it is for me. And what about you?
I mean, with The Shape of Shadows and the last one, Testament of Gideon Blythe, neither of the PDFs are out yet. So I can talk about them, but unfortunately, if people want to go look at them, that won't happen for another few months. But I can talk about Field Guide because I feel like it might be helpful for people if they want a text to reference later to be able to go grab it. Whoa, my camera. But with Field Guide, I feel like we were so in sync when we wrote that game that there
Yeah.
was be like technical and like very subtle and refined, but there were things that I did very deliberately from the get-go, including and you helped me with this because I actually like slipped a couple times. I really tried, and it might not be perfect, but I really tried to never tell the player what their character is feeling. And so,
Mhm.
for example, there's a prompt in Field Guide if it's okay to like spoil one prompt, but if you don't want to be spoiled for anything, like this is where you cover your ears. I'll hold up my mug when I'm done. And there's one prompt where you read a letter from the Institute, which is the bureaucratic institution that you are trying to your character is trying to get their like beloved mentors research from. Um, and whatever's in that letter makes you crumple it up and throw it at the wall. But it doesn't even say the letter makes you crumple it up and throw it at the wall. The prompt,
Mhm.
I'm paraphrase it, is you read the letter, crumple it up, and throw it as hard as you can at the wall. There is
Yes, we explain action, but not emotion.
literally none, because if that kind of thing is even a little dissonant, if a player is
Mhm.
character experience that is not in tune with that feeling, it can cause friction that pulls them out of playing the game. That is not always true. So in Gideon Blythe, there are several prompts that say, how alienated your character feels, or how, a moment of connection. And that's also deliberate. That's because it is a much more specific story with themes that I want to actively guide a player towards. That being said, there's still a lot of freedom in the creative act. And so, and it's also a story that deals a lot with like the
Excuse me.
family versus like, what you want to do as an individual. So having those themes work out literally physically, like in process, I wanted to make the crafting process more like defined, but make the prose around it, therefore, like fill it out in another way. And so in my writing, I tend to balance those two out. If like the crafting is very streamlined, then the prose tends to be a little more elaborate as well.
Yeah, I think my own methods are, I think, actually very different. I always I always write a lot and then I'll get rid. I'm an extremely unsentimental editor. And I think I did that a lot to Field Guide, where I'm just like, just get rid of these chunks. So I'll write a lot. I actually have a very long ideation process where I do a lot of thinking. I do a lot of typing in my notes app in the shower, which is where I get all my good ideas. But then when I get around to actually writing the thing, I tend to be very concise. I don't think any of my games that I've written so far have been more than like 4,000 words, not counting Field Guide, which is almost certainly longer.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a really good question in the chat, which is how much thought do either of us give to accessibility?
Yeah. Do you want to go first or?
Yeah, I can go first. I was thinking, actually, that was something I was thinking a lot about while doing A Mending, specifically because it is a game that requires a lot of physical and visual skill and coordination. It is to explain, it is an embroidery game. It is a game where you embroider a path on a cloth map from one spot to another. And it is at a very beginner's level of embroidery, because I am also a beginner's embroiderer, but it is embroidery nevertheless. So for A Mending, a huge thing that I had to do was I talked to a lot of friends who were embroiderers, but who also have like physical limitations. About things that I could do. And one of the major things that came up was actually just threading needles. They were like, threading needles is just one of the hardest things to do. And so for the actual kits, I looked into providing self-threading needles. And self-threading needles are these needles where you kind of just pull the thread through, and they thread themselves. And after doing more research and talking to more people, I actually ended up including pre-threaded needles instead. So every physical copy of A Mending shipped out with a little pack of pre-threaded needles, like you would get in a sewing kit. And doing that research actually showed me that despite all the recommendations for self-threaded needles, when talking to people who actually had trouble threading needles, self-threading needles were actually not a great choice because they created like so many other issues. And in addition to that, because A Mending overfunded by so much, I set aside, I'm trying to think of the exact amount, I think I set aside $3,000 for anyone who, saw something that they could improve with A Mending's accessibility, and wanted to be paid to improve that. And that could be anything from like producing a large text version of the game, or producing a map with raised map like lines. And in addition, I am offering a commercial license for anyone who wants to, a free commercial license for anyone who wants to adapt the game and produce a product that would be more accessible. And there also is a Creative Commons license on it. So anyone that would like to just build on it for their own use is completely free to do so without asking me. But if they wanted to sell it, and the specific thing they were improving on was accessibility, then I would give them a free commercial license to do so. And a lot of that is just that, yes, I care a lot about accessibility, but I am also a perfectly able-bodied person. So it's just me recognizing that accessibility work is important work, and it is work that other people are extremely good at and have devoted significant chunks of their life to. And similarly, they also deserve to be compensated for that work. So my plans for A Mending is essentially pay people to make it more accessible. So if anyone has pitches for me, I have money set aside for that.
I love that. I love that you were able to trace the process of like how you consulted, took the consultation advice, implemented it, and then it turned out that like the the most elegant solution is to pay someone a fair rate to adapt it according to their area of expertise if they are an accessibility designer, because I have disabilities, but they're not generally physical. So I'm kind
Right. Same.
and I just know that the act of creating from the ground up is easier than trying to go back and, in fact, mend things that have been, frayed for certain people's experiences that you have to like patch, because that creates its own patch,
Mhm.
et cetera, et cetera. And so, like, I actually want like accessibility. When we say accessibility, I feel like, especially in the realm of discussing it online, uh, has turned into a catch-all term where I now, for my own clarity, have to ask people what they mean.
Mhm.
So, as accessibility, are they concentrating on a particular focus? This isn't me like being like, whoever asked that, turning it back on you. Like, this is my thought process. So, for example, when it comes to accessibility around vision or hearing, that's something where I might hire a consultant and or offer a grant like you did, depending on like the funding of the project and the scope. But there's also time and there's also money. And there, with my background in childhood education, there's also like parenting. What I found is, and this is not what would traditionally maybe be called an accessibility issue, but often people use the term accessibility in this way, which is not how I understood the term to be, but I am addressing like the possibility that it is being used this way in this question. I've heard the term accessibility used basically to kind of mean like a broad lack of something that would make the game easier to play. And a common thing that I hear a lot is parents saying that with child rearing, they don't have a lot of time, like access to free time, something that not everyone has. And that is something that is at the forefront of my mind when I design games. The traditional tabletop game is a social game. Like, all games are social. All games are social because all games are make believe. Even if you're playing it by yourself, it's still social. But tabletop games, you have to gather up your friends. You have to make sure you're all on the same page. And then you have to find the time. And then you have to commit hours of time. Sometimes like every week, every month. But like as adults, it's very hard to do that. And if you're raising kids, it's like, when can you do that, right? Whose house are you going to meet at? Do you have to suddenly leave? Um, Solo games are games where I really want to emphasize that you play them on your own time. So with Field Guide and The Shape of Shadows, there was like a live run, we called it, where we sent out those daily email prompts. That was for people who wanted that experience, that pacing for that run. But it's never intrinsic or in the rules where it has to be daily, because that
Mhm.
is actually not accessible to most people with their time. Um,
And
so
we've actually been talking about I mean, we learned so much during Field Guide that we are talking about spacing things out more. And I think you spaced things out more in The Shape of Shadows.
yeah,
You
that
know,
ended
you added a break.
a clown show just because of like stuff. But the intention, and I stuck with it in the beginning, was to have 2 days of prompts, an intermission day, like Wednesday was always
Mhm.
a off, and then 2 more days, and then you have the weekend off. And the reason for that is because I noticed with Field Guide, people were creating these intricate things, and then they would feel like they were behind. They got that like
Yeah.
that school deadline feeling, it seemed like, from like what they were writing. I was like, I don't want people to feel that way. So
Yeah, no, totally.
yeah, that was,
Um,
and the weekends were intended for.
yeah. I'm implementing a similar thing in an upcoming game of mine, Remember August, where I'm doing, I think, 2 prompts a week, but you can choose to play it via email, which is 2 prompts a week,
Mhm.
or you can just wait for your mail,
I'm gonna do the wait for my mail. I'm so
which is just wait for your physical mail. It arrives when it arrives. Like, I'm sorry. I'm also dealing with the USPS, which is a whole new experience that I'm dealing with. But the pacing, like the cadence of a game, is so interesting. It's such an interesting factor to consider, I think, with
yeah,
games like connected path games and the kind of games we make.
Yeah, and I have a couple. It's interesting because every format of game you've mentioned, like I don't have that many games
Yeah,
actually.
neither do I.
Not picky exactly, but I buy what I know I'm gonna make because I hate having things that I'm not gonna use. I have a lot of stuff. I am a maximalist, but I want to use all of it.
Hmm.
Uh, there are some games I have. There's one I haven't played yet called The Beast, which is a really intense game where you have a series of dreams over 20 days. It has to be played every day over
Oh
20 days.
my God.
Can't tell
That
anybody.
sounds extremely intense.
No, I'm like, should I like take a time off to do this? Because then at the end of the game, you don't tell anyone what you write ever. Like that is a rule in the game. And so it's a really fascinating,
Wow.
and like the buy-in has to be quite high, which is
Yeah.
a solo game. With a tabletop like game, the buy-in is like the social coordination, energy, and time. But I would actually love to talk about USPS and supply chains and like mail stuff as a reason for why we did the Keepsake game as well, and why like it works so well even with supply chain disruption. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also worth mentioning that part of the reason why keepsake games are so appealing to us is because we both care so much about objects. Like we are both people that have a lot of stuff. And we are people who are very sentimental about things. And we are people that want to reduce waste.
yeah,
Um, and we didn't want to just make a game that gets, that stays in its box
yeah,
that just becomes like a thing that collects dust that you collect. We wanted it to be something that, the player engages with. And once a player engages with something, once they create a piece of art, something that makes it theirs, it becomes an artifact. It becomes an artifact of play that they hold on to. I mean, I hold on to my like early D&D
yeah,
character sheets. These are still things I'm very nostalgic about.
yeah. I have
Um,
from like years and years and years ago when I first started playing. I think the first game I ever played was Dread, and I basically wrote
mhm.
an like fanfic about
Oh,
like
of course, yeah.
it was so cool. I
But
never
you care about that. Like I still have my foam swords, my foam LARPing swords that I made from duct tape.
that, but that game was formative because I thought that was what all tabletop games were like. I thought they were all weird and like and different from each other. So it was like a very strange thing to discover that that's like actually at the time certainly was an outlier in its design format, but also like when we imbue things with meaning, um they take on a life of their own. They become in our minds and our hearts like living things like this. And I think part of this is my upbringing is Korean. My family's Korean and I'm second generation, and my parents and grandparents put a lot of effort into making sure that I was going to stay connected to my family and to my heritage and to the way that we maintain family traditions. And one of those are altars, which I've been thinking about a lot recently. We kept a family altar when my grandfather passed. We took his funeral photo, which is something that
Mhm.
Koreans take a photo like every few years so that you have it if you die, for your
Yeah,
family.
I have my grandparents. They're over there on my desk.
Yeah. I only have one thing of my grandmother's. It's a drinking glass with a chrysanthemum
Hmm.
on its own altar for her. I don't even have a photograph of her, but I have that. And it's imbued with the memory of her drinking her like cold, cold barley tea out of it on summer days when she had a friend over. Like these things take on life because not only of our own like kind of intrinsic tendency toward like sentimentality and attachment, but also for me, and this is why I emphasize my background in diaspora when we were talking about field guides so much. For me, it's because of the way that I was raised, which is
Mhm.
very not like middle class suburban white America. Like even the way that I've been talking about grieving in my personal life is very much informed by how I was raised rather than like the dominant culture around me. And so
Yeah, same.
yeah, and like so objects having meaning and objects being important and like being engaged with as though they are also alive with us and next to us, that is something that's second nature to me. But it's not.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that is like a perfect transition to what we actually started talking about before I got us on this tangent,
Yeah,
which is why our ephemera in Field Guide works so well.
Yeah.
Because we made the very conscious decision that every single piece of ephemera that you received in the mail afterwards was something that existed in Elizabeth Lee's office.
Yes. Yeah.
Like it was, this is again a bit of a spoiler. So if you
Yeah.
don't, if you don't want it, actually, you know what? You know what? It actually is not a spoiler
Oh,
because the coda was only sent out to people that received physical mail, and we're not doing that again.
oh right.
So, so your game it's a coda. It's like an epilogue. The game is complete without it. But so after you finish playing the game via email, about a month later, you would receive a package from a character that you had been corresponding with, and it said, "Hey, I've gotten the key to Elizabeth Lee's office, and I thought you might want some of her things." Because I have taken over her office. I'm like the love of her life, and I'm distributing her things to the people that loved her most. Um, and so you would come across all these things
Yeah.
that you had seen during the game because they were being sent to you like in some way or another. But Elizabeth Lee also had copies of all of these things. Or you were hearing from people who sent them in the first place and were like sending a copy along to you.
And this is where I got on the digression. I'm going to try. So the thing I was talking about was supply chain, shipping, and mail delays.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, not just games people, like literally everyone's dealing with right now. And like we actually kind of designed around that because even during that
We
point,
absolutely designed around that.
so much mail delay. We were like, we don't want to ship stuff. Like that's actually why we emphasized, and there was still misunderstanding about it because it's kind of unusual. But like that's why we emphasized the physical ephemera was a coda at the end of.
Yeah. It is not essential. You
Yeah.
could print these objects as well.
Yes. Thing, right? We designed the game deliberately so that you could print or order pretty cheaply from like Staples or an office store prints of everything that was visual in the game, because we knew that if we had to ship it, it would be more expensive for us and they might not get it in time. But also like it's that imbuing of meaning, right? Like you creating something, even something like just printing it out, holding it in your hand, trimming it down and pasting it in a journal, you put yourself into that. And with shipping delays and talking to a lot of my friends who work in board games or have board game components in their games, or even just like printing out things on cardboard covers is hard right now.
Mm-hmm.
It made me think a lot about manufacturing because I've resisted doing merchandise. I just don't see the point of merchandise. It's very stressful in terms of like tracking income stream, but also it's like wasteful. It is intrinsically wasteful
Mm-hmm.
about it. I promise this is not a digression. My sister and her partner are actually, and it's up and you can see it, I'll try to link it later, a directory of manufacturing entities that have like renewable or not renewable purpose at the root, or which have like FSC certification. And they did that because of things like board games and manufacturing and outsourcing to China. All of these things are not essential in making a game. They are not.
No.
If you want to make a game that is about personal meaning being given to something. And that
Exactly.
like that was a huge thing with Field Guide, and the shipping crisis has really emphasized like it's not that I won't do merch, but it has to be thoughtful and deliberate.
Yes, and also, I mean, we sidestepped that completely because all our ordering was domestic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that was something we wanted to stick to. I did that for A Mending as well, and if I can brag a little, I fulfilled A Mending which was over, I think, about 3,000 packages in 3 months.
You're
3 months after closing the Kickstarter.
yeah.
Um, and that was because we did domestic printing, like Field Guide. Oh, Jeeyon, did you drop off? Okay, well, you might have, but I am going to just continue talking. Field Guide was shipped in an envelope, and all the objects in it were all printed domestically. They were all processed. Welcome back. Sorry, I was talking because I was like, well, all right, I'll just keep on talking. And A Mending, like the bag for A Mending, is just a screen printed cotton pouch. And it's a screen print cotton pouch because it does fit with the aesthetic of the game, and it is what I want like the feeling of it to look like. But also, you can get cotton pouches screen printed domestically. They do not have to come on a boat from China.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons why I'm only going to do domestic, even for my books. And even though it's very expensive and people keep telling me not to, it's like, well, if I budget for it, because you can't get FSC certification. FSC is the Forest Service.
Yeah.
Misremember.
For sustainability, you know what? I'm not really sure, but the point is that all our printing is done with an FSC certified facility.
Have been around since 1997. They are notoriously stringent about their criteria. If you don't meet it, you just don't meet it, and they audit companies like every couple of years. So before even the terms renewed or carbon neutral or offsetting, which is such a nonsense term, like existed, this third-party entity was grading manufacturing companies on whether or not they were actually sustainable. You can't do that overseas. And so because that is very important to me, I would rather make games whose scope don't demand that I outsource to China or wherever, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to.
And it's like, look, printing is much cheaper in China, but it definitely becomes less cheap when you like have to pay like $10,000 to get your items over to you. Supply chain issues have really changed the accounting of producing a game. And so we're coming to the last like 8 minutes or so of this. And we're gonna give the Big Bad Con sign off as well. So let's end with like, what would you sort of recommend to people who are, looking into making Keepsake and Connected Path games of their own?
Oh, designing them themselves?
Designing them themselves.
I would say don't actually look at other games. And I actually recommend this for any game design. Think about the art that you enjoy, about the thing at the core of what you want to make that's important. Then start designing the logistics and physicalities around that. And think about what people have and think about what they would have to get. That's actually like the major logistical thing. Like if you want to make a game that revolves around like putting something in a locket, it's a beautiful idea. Do people have a locket at home, or would they have to order one? How expensive is it? How big would it have to be? Like these are the things that you want to take into consideration, but don't start there. Start with like the heart of what you want to make. That's what we did for Field Guide, and it worked out very good.
It worked out great. Someone also said Forest Stewardship Council is what FSC stands for.
I have a terrible memory for.
No, so do I. I was actually explaining somewhat recently that like I have a card catalog memory. Like I cannot remember any details. I can only remember pathways.
Like the meaning of things, but not the words that get you to.
Yes, I can remember like how to search for something in like an archive, where I will then find the answer that I'm looking for. Pathways, but I think that feels very reflected in the games that we make as well.
Absolutely,
it's like we send people on all of these like miscellaneous tangents. And we're like, oh, you want to follow this down? Like in Field Guide, some people got like really carried away with certain parts of the game. They were like, yeah, I'm just really into like all the domestic birds in my area now. And we're like,
one person got into hiking and started doing and like grading the hiking. Another person made a paper mache skull.
The paper mache skull! Oh my gosh, that was incredible. And it was just so great to see our players like discovering the joy of making things again and the joy of sharing things. And I think that's ultimately really why we make Keepsake and Connected Path games, because we like watching people play them and discover new things.
Keepsake games are designed to try to capture that kind of childlike joy in just making and sharing objects and stories that everyone has, but it's hard to kind of like go back to it unself-consciously as an adult. And that's the biggest thing with Keepsake games that I want to do. I want people to feel good about making something and sharing it with people.
Oh yeah, sorry, in chat, someone wants clarification if me playing for the queen goes against the advice of not looking at other games. And I'm like, no, that's Jeeyon's advice. Jeeyon's advice is don't look at other games. My advice is consume broadly, like suck in inspiration from everything and everyone. If anything, I would only say that in addition, like, don't necessarily be inspired by only other games.
That's,
Like, if the only thing that you are consuming is other games, then your games will largely be a mashup of those other games.
I hate
Um,
look at other games
which,
first. Don't do it first. You can look at
yeah,
it.
yeah. Which, to be fair, I did say that my story building card deck was a mashup of like two games, but the but that is only one element of my game. Most of the game is about embroidery, which is coming from embroidering
Yeah,
and and making maps. Um, so yeah, my advice for people is to be absolutely indulgent in your interest outside of games, like whatever they are. Like, get absorbed in them. If it's writing fanfic, get super into it. If it's like reading up about old dead musical theater people, wonderful. Just sink yourself into your obsessions,
I
because people can always tell when you're making a game about your obsessions, like, and they connect with that.
I love that word indulgent. I don't
Yeah,
know if we've ever used it before, but it's perfect. It's
yeah.
perfect.
I use it all the time. I'm just like, I'm an indulgent person. I'm going to like do the things I love, and it's going to come through in our work, and I think we both do a really great job of that.
Yeah, I definitely lead with enthusiasm. It's something you
Just super, yes, absolutely.
yeah.
So we're coming to the end of our time, and I was told that we are also doing the sign off for Big Bad Con in general.
Hey!
So to sign off for Big Bad Con and tell everyone thank you. What is something you love about this event?
Oh man, I mean, Big Bad Online specifically was a completely adaptive process. And I love how everyone just was like, okay, we're adapting. And this
Mhm.
has been such a cool thing to see the panels go all the way through the night to accommodate international,
Yeah,
the highlighting of non-US game communities. I love that every single year, no matter what it looks like, Big Bad Con grows beyond what it's already done. It's always iterating, always adapting, always evolving. And that's the thing I love the most about Big Bad Con that I think is really special to it specifically. What about you?
me. I was actually just looking up a panel because I wanted to credit it properly. But I caught two panels, and they were both absolutely wonderful. One was the one called, I had to look it up. Uh, oh, it was about violence. It was about violence in design. Um, and it had, I need to find the actual, I will post on Twitter later the panel I was talking about. Um, but it was just an amazing panel that really drew attention to combat and violence and whether it was necessary in games at all. And the other one I caught was a panel by Everest Pitkin, Kara Sershan, and Ben Roswell. And it was about oracles and divination and when meanings break. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And Caro did this breakdown of oracle, of the process of divination, that was just some of like the clearest explanation
Yeah.
of the divination process that I've ever seen. And it's like, I've been doing this for like 10 years, and they just wrote it in 4 words. And I was like, oh geez,
People,
okay.
my one sentence, they have my utmost admiration. Kara's an amazing designer.
Absolutely.
Out Kara's games and like yeah, I that you saying that on Twitter made me want to watch that panel. So I'm
Yes, it's a fantastic panel. Please go back, everyone, and check out some panels you missed. I'm going to be doing that for the rest of the week, and I'm extremely excited about that. And with that, I think we are. Ooh, ooh,
because I just want to mention very quickly if you also have watched a panel that you're enthusiastic about, there is a post panel chat channel in the Big Bang,
yes,
and that is where people are congregating to discuss these ideas further or just like give recommendations or whatever. So go check that out because it's a really cool Discord server and community.
yeah. The conversation continues on Discord and Twitter and other places. But yes, please hop on and talk about the things that you loved about Big Bag Con. And yeah, I guess we're closing.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming to Big Bad Con 2021. And hopefully we'll get to see you all in person in a coming year.
Let's hope so. Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.